Good morning, everyone. This session will be focused on the relation between inclusion of all types of qualification in NQF and validation of non-formal and informal learning. But I have to highlight that the validation was not a direct subject of NQF-in research and analysis, so please treat this session as some additional value for the project and one of the potential direction of further research and analysis, and who knows, maybe the next project. So in our work, we were aware of a substantial difference between those two concepts of validation of non-formal and informal learning and non-formal sector qualifications. And they should not be confused, especially that in some countries the term validation is used in different contexts. For example, as validation of training program or even validation of the awarding body. So we would like to say that in this session we mentioned the validation of learning outcomes. And validation is understood as the process where learning outcomes of an individual are assessed in order to gain a full or partial qualification. And Council recommendation of 2012 says about 4 stages: identification, documentation, assessment, and certification. So in broader sense, broader understanding of the validation, it can be limited to, for example, first stage, identification, to do the skills audit of an individual. And in some countries there are different terms for validation of non-formal and informal learning. For example, in France, there is validation of acquired experience. But it's not only difference in terms. It also differs in premises of validation. It means that in France, a candidate can go through validation only if she or he has professional experience at least 1 year. It was 3 years before, but now after changes it's only one year. Or this term validation, in some countries it's recognition of prior learning, for example in Scotland. And non-formal sector qualifications refers to types of qualification outside the school education system, and those types were presented yesterday in the morning session. And of course, non-formal sector qualifications can be obtained through a validation procedure. And validation can be used as a tool to motivate, to increase motivation and participation in lifelong learning. It was mentioned in the previous session, but it will work only if there are many qualifications included in the national qualification frameworks, and if they can be awarded through validation procedures. Another objective of the validation is to make visible skills which were gained in different contexts from formal school system, for example at work or by doing some hobby activities or during volunteering at home by completing some e-learning courses. And that's very important concerning employability and mobility, especially for people who lost their jobs after working several years in one sector. They often do not believe that they can transfer their skills from one sector to another, so validation for them means a lot. They can learn how to present their skills, and they build trust in their abilities. And those objectives, matching skills and labor demand and fighting social exclusion, are especially important for school leavers, for unemployed people or people at risk of unemployment, because they can improve their chances to gain some formal recognition of what they can do and improve their chances to be back on the labor market. And the importance of validation is mentioned in many documents, many strategic documents on national and on European level. So, for example, a Council recommendation of 2012 of validation advised to link validation arrangements to national qualifications framework, and that's very important, especially in countries with long traditions of validation, because in some countries validation is implemented before implementation of national qualification framework, and in some it's a similar process. In the same time, solutions are designed for validation and qualification system. Another strategic document which has wider objective to better link formal, non-formal and informal learning and support the validation of learning outcomes gained in different contexts, in different settings. But it's not, we will not talk about all documents. Of course, there's also a recommendation on upskilling pathways which concern low-skilled adults, and there is also one stage related to the validation. And here we have a key question for this session. Is a coherent approach used for all qualifications in the system in terms of the validation of non-formal and informal learning? So we would like to analyze how the inclusion of a qualification affects, influence validation procedure. And here I picked two basic characteristics of a validation system. The first one is if the qualification included in National Qualifications Framework is accessible through validation of non-formal and informal learning. And the second one, if a candidate received the same certificates as those acquired through formal education. And it can be differentiated in many ways. For example, in the way the time of completion of this training or validation is presented on the certificates, or grades are different, or the level of qualification is different for validation for some type of qualification. And here we have first type of link between National Qualification Framework and validation with two yes. It means that all qualifications included are accessible through validation, and certificates are the same. And good example of this link can be France, because to include a qualification in French national framework, qualification must be accessible through validation. And this type is possible due to regulations which require and enforce validation, and it also reflects the ability and great infrastructure for validation in France. So the second type is with no and yes. No, not all qualifications included in the framework are accessible through validation, but certificates are the same. And I think a good example of this type is Scotland, because many organizations have regulations, their own regulation about the minimum amount of credit, so they can decide how much credit, if any, can be awarded through validation procedure. Type 3. Yes, it's all qualifications included are accessible through validation, but certificates can be differentiated. And for this type, I'm not sure which country can be example. I hope during plenary discussion, some of you might identify example for this type. And type 4 of link between national qualifications framework and validation. Not all qualifications included in framework are accessible through validation, and certificates can be different. And this example, Poland can be an example for this type of links. And that's a very important question, how we can facilitate validation of non-formal and informal learning. And I think the answer is to divide qualification into smaller parts, and to gain this qualification gradually. And I think France has this approach with blocks of competences, but it's very important that in some countries it's perceived in different ways. For example, if someone gains part of qualification, it can be perceived as a failure. So people prefer to gain a full qualification at the very beginning and not gain a qualification through, for example, 1 year long procedure. And for this plenary session, I prepared 4 points of discussion. What types of links between the national qualification framework and validation do you have in your country? And what are premises behind the designed solution? And please share your opinion about consequences of the 2 presented characteristics, this accessibility of attaining qualification by validation and differentiation of certificates. And maybe you have some idea of other characteristics which we should concern in our further analysis. And for at the beginning, before passing the microphone for the audience, I would like to invite to discussion table Mrs. Madhu Singh, Senior Program Specialist from UNESCO Institute for Lifelong Learning, and Mrs. Urska Marentic, Deputy Director from Institute of Republic of Slovenia for VET. So I think we can start with country example of Slovenia to learn more about these links between validation and types of qualification in another country outside our NQF-in project.
me to the conference, that I could share with you our experience, or maybe it's better to say the challenges to link validation of non-formal and informal learning and to Slovenian qualification framework. Maybe at the beginning to say some information about our Slovenian qualification framework. We have it from 2013, so we are the new one from the frameworks, and we have also from 2016 Slovenian Qualification Act. So we have the legal basis now for the framework. When we developed the framework, we decided to have the comprehensive framework, so we put all type of qualification, general, vocational and higher education in one framework. Our framework has 10 levels, and the levels from 7 to 10 are for the higher education. These are linked to the 6 to 8 in European qualification framework. Also our framework is mainly communication framework, but one part is also the reform part of the framework. I would like also to underline that all the qualification we put in the framework, each qualification must go through some of the accreditation procedure before including this qualification in framework, because we want to have quality assurance qualifications in framework. We have 3 types of qualification. First type are educational qualifications. They are results of formal education, and the school leaving certificate or diploma is awarded as proof of qualification. Then we have national vocational qualifications, and these are the qualifications that can be obtained after the validation of non-formal and informal learning, and the NVQ certificate is awarded as a proof of qualification. And the third type of the qualification is new, and this part is the reform part of our framework. These are the supplementary qualifications. They are new. The procedure for the including for the referencing this qualification in the framework was defined in the Slovenian Qualification Act. So they are really new from 2016. And these are the non-formal private qualification, because in the discussion of when we developed the Slovenian qualification framework from the part of the employer and sectors, we get the demand to open the framework also to the sectoral or non-formal qualification from the company. So now we started with this new system, and they are private qualification, and the property of these qualifications stay by the provider. But I think these are the type of qualification we discussed yesterday about the non-formal qualification, sectoral qualifications. But if I get back to the validation of non-formal learning, we have 2 main regulated routes how to recognize or validate non-formal learning in Slovenia. We have for the two purposes. One is for the further education, informal education, and one is for the labor market, and for those are the national vocational qualification. In the type of the educational qualification, we have only validation for the purpose of further education, and not the whole qualification can be obtained through the validation of non-formal learning. But we have the second pillar of our framework. These are national vocational qualification. We have ACT on those NVQs. We developed from the 2000. Now we have, I think, 300 of those qualifications. The Act defined the procedure for the validation, and we have all the phases of the identification, the documentation, assessment, and recognition of those. And now I think it's 95,000 of people who gained this qualification in Slovenia. The basis for those qualifications are occupational standards. We prepare them with the social partners, and in first phase they are adopted by our sectoral committees, and those sectoral committees define if for the occupational standard is needed in the labor market, need to prepare also the national vocational qualifications. Maybe it's important to say that we try to connect the system of VET educational system and NVQ because the occupational standards are basis for both routes. Because in Slovenia, we are a small country, 40 million people, we have broader educational programs and more than one occupational standard basis for our educational program and educational qualification. And some of the occupational standard, if the sectoral committee decides there is the need for the validation of non-formal learning in the labor market, then we prepared also the NVQ. Maybe in this phase it's enough.
Thank you for sharing your experience. Now we would like to ask Madhu to comment on this session.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this session. To begin with, I would like to say that the inclusion of non-formal sector qualifications into national qualification frameworks and the validation of non-formal and informal learning are actually two separate issues. You can't really, I think whether they're non-formal qualifications or qualifications, they should be accessible to validation. There should be no reason why you should make this differentiation with regard to validation. You know, it all depends on, like in the Slovenian case, there are some qualifications that lend themselves more easily to validation. For example, the VET sector. It lends itself because they have occupational standards and practical experience, experiential learning is gained through, is given a greater value through in the vocational qualification framework. So, I mean, there are these sort of things, but basically they're two separate issues which should not really be confused. It can also be very confusing if you call non-formal sector, inclusion in non-formal sector, and the validation of non-formal and informal learning. It really needs explanation. That's one thing. And the second thing is about that qualifications frameworks need to be inclusive. That, you know, you really need to have, and I find that Slovenia is really a very good example where it has brought in this third sector of supplementary qualifications, so that there are people who are really outside this educational system have access to qualifications. So in that sense, you have this link between non-formal and validation, I think. You know, that is very important. And the other point is about, I think the purposes of validation should be clarified. Is it for the labor market? Is it for entry into the labor market? Or is it for entry into further education and training, which also came out very clearly in the Slovenian case study. So the purposes have to be clear, whether it's for employability, whether it's for just visibility, whether it's for the enterprise who wants to do take stock of the skills that are available in the enterprises, is he doing validation for that reason, so that he can design more training programs if there are skill deficits in the enterprise. So I think the validation is are arrangements where I think purposes have to be foregrounded. That's another thing. And regarding this, these four models, I will not go into this because it needs more care into this. But basically, you know, I think the majority of countries, from all the survey that UNESCO has been doing, the majority of countries, in the majority of countries, validation is subsumed under acts that are passed under the establishment of national qualification frameworks. In other words, for any qualification that is put in a register or is put on the national qualification framework, validation is a requirement. At least in the countries we are doing, it is already subsumed in the NQF Act. So there may be other countries where this is not the case, but in most of the cases in the countries that are in the process of developing comprehensive national qualification frameworks, this is the case. So there's a legal basis for validation also. And then NQFs provide a central reference point for the validation of non-formal and formal learning. And I think where this is the case, where this is the case, I think it is very important that qualifications are included in the directory or in the register, because that really gives a social recognition and legitimacy to the validation process also. You know, so that the validation process is also accepted by all stakeholders if it is a requirement in the qualification. I think that is very important. Then in many countries, you also find that validation is not a standalone arrangement. It is always included in some other instruments. For example, the case of Scotland, I think, it's a part of the credit process, credit accumulation and transfer process. I mean, at least you have the same system in Australia where validation is not a standalone process, but it's incorporated into the credit accumulation and transfer CAT process. This is the same thing which is happening also in the Hong Kong qualification framework, where the credit processes are also taken into account. So I think that the notion of the thing, in fact, the Australian qualification framework has recently moved the validation arrangements into credit rating processes. I mean, just to give you some examples from that thing. Further trend in a lot of countries is the development of comprehensive NQFs. The more comprehensive your qualification framework is, the more you can use validation to transition from one sector to another. So the articulation is, through validation, you can also have this articulation between different sectors. That means you can have, you know, the articulation between higher education and vocational training, for example, which is something where validation is being used in Germany, you know, at the ANCOM arrangement, where you know, you have practical experience through the dual system and through practice in your work-related field. If you collect 5 years of experience, you can then get automatic access to an examination or even automatic exemption from certain modules in higher education. So it allows you access into higher education, universities of applied sciences. So validation in that sense is also related to there's linkages between two sectors, but also to mobility from the vocational to the higher education, and it's also related to getting a degree, related to getting a qualification, leading to a qualification. And as I told you, that the more the comprehensive qualification framework is, the more intersectoral articulation you have, also articulation between different sectors of society, between the labor market and the academic area. For example, Mexico is a very important example, where they started with labor market qualifications, and it was called the National System of Competency Standards, NSCS. They started with this system, and then gradually, with the setup of the Mexican Bank of Academic Credits, what is now happening is that people who get a certification in the labor market sector through the National System of Competency Standards, they can be accredited, these certifications can be accredited as part of formal education programs. You know, so it gives even more legitimacy to validation here is giving more legitimacy in terms of its value also in the academic field. You know, so this sort of, you have the credit bank, you have the labor market competency standards, and also the equivalence with the academic sector. You know, so the Ministry of Education is now also collaborating with the Ministry of Labor and Skills Development. So I think there are a lot of value also in, there's a lot of, I think validation is also a process which is promoting qualifications in a way, because it's creating a demand for new qualifications and quality qualifications. And in many of the developing countries, what is happening is that qualification, that validation does not lead immediately. You know what you mentioned, that it's a gradual process. There are so many deficits. So it's integrated into training programs, you know, and validation is integrated into entry to a certain training program, which leads to a qualification. You know, so I think these sort of things are very important. And so this I really like the thing. It has to be unitized, and training programs also have certain modules which are then lead to a full qualification, but they are part qualification. So training programs are organized in such a way that they are part qualifications which then join up to a thing. So these are just a few things, and of course qualifications frameworks have a communication role, and they make validation easier because qualifications help to clarify the formal demands in a qualification. So once you have that, then assessors can interpret the individual competencies in relation to these formal demands. You see? So even the communicative role of qualifications play a very important role in linking validation to qualifications, because the pathways are then more clearer, the formal demands of qualifications are more clearer, and it's easier for assessors, guiders, and you know, and then of course the last thing that has to be done is to have proper validation arrangements with, you know, with personnel, with resources, assessment centers, guiders, personnel who can then have also follow the, and it is here actually that, you know, where you have to have very fair validation processes so that the integrity of the qualification is not hampered. And that's where I think once you have a French system has a very has played a lot, has put in a lot of energy in ensuring that the validation process is fair, and it is that the evidence you know, is valid, it's reliable, so that the integrity of the qualifications are not hampered. And that's where then you can say that the non-formal and informal learning is on equal footing with formal qualifications. That's where you can really be sure that you can say there's parity of esteem between formal and non-formal. I think I'll stop there. And I mean, I can say more, but you know, I think I will stop there.
Thank you very much for your comments. Yes, concerning this acceptance of stakeholders, I was always wondering how stakeholders in France accepted this, that all qualification in the framework can be accessed through validation, especially from higher education. So that's a very, very good question, but I saw that there is a question from audience, so I will pass microphone.
Thank you, Sylvia. Yes, I agree with most of what's been said, but I would like to introduce a small element of conservatism and caution into the discussion. Let's just remind ourselves what a qualification actually is. It's a social guarantee that the person bearing the qualification can do what the qualification states they can do. And that has enormous consequences if you think of safety criticality, for example. It really is important that it serves as a guarantee and that it has the trust that guarantees should have. So therefore, just to pick up a phrase that Madhu used, the qualification has to have validity. It has to bear knows or can do what the qualification says they can do. And I'm going to just go back again briefly to the English experience because I think it's instructive. England's been a laboratory for a lot of these innovations over the years. And if something goes wrong in the laboratory, then people ought to pay attention. And it's very interesting what happened to NBQ. The name still exists. You can only get an NBQ if there's a work-based learning element. But, and it's a huge but, there has got to be guided learning within it as well. And it's very interesting there to look at what the off-qual people say in their blog. The reason they put that new stipulation in is because they had doubts about the validity of work-based learning only qualifications. Now, why should that be? Well, I think there's an important reason for that. And if you're trying to assess competence, it's not enough just to assess what somebody could do in the past, which is what purely work-based learning does, but what they will be able to do in the future and in hypothetical circumstances which they may not yet have encountered. And for that to be done, clearly you can't just assess in the workplace, you have to have some other means. And I would suggest that what you have to fall back on is knowledge of the area in which you're working, if you like, savoir or wissen in two other European languages. You need that in order to make appropriate professional judgments. And the only way to do that is to interrogate the candidate to find out what they would do in such and such circumstances. So what I'm suggesting, therefore, is that part validation of prior experience is probably essential, but we have to look very, very carefully indeed at whether or not full validation of qualifications can be achieved through those means.
Can I just say something on that, because I find this is very important, because you see that I think validation does have its limitations in that sense, because if you're only taking into account work experience and 5 years of work experience, you really find that a lot of people actually also lack basic education. You know, all this upskilling pathways which the European Union, you know, they don't see that, you know, validation can't compensate for the lack of basic education. You know, and I think that's the point you're saying, that knowledge is still going to be lacking, you know, but the good thing about validation is that if it can promote progression, you know, it should promote progression into further education and training, and I think that's very important. I think one of the things that we have been trying to do is that it should propose that, you know, labor market entry with just work experience is not going to help you improve your knowledge base. It's only by further education and proper education. This articulation with the academic is very important. I just want to reiterate what you said. I think it's a very important point.
Yes, just to reflect the question raised from national Hungarian circumstances. So that's we use parallelly two terminologies, sometimes with overlapping meanings. So that's recognition of prior learning and the validation of experiences distinction, the reasons behind this distinction is quite close to the Slovenian approach. So the educational qualification, in this context we use recognition of prior learning. So, for instance, the matura examination can be taken without schooling. So everybody can take it. But for higher education qualification, it's impossible to get a full diploma without attending courses. So the recognition of prior learning works to accumulate credits so that the RP recognition of prior learning, so to say, the validation process is to get credits and to get some kind of exemption to accomplish a course, but not to get a full diploma. And the validation goes for the national vocational qualifications, and the national vocational qualification register in Hungary, which is not equal with the qualification framework. This is a training sector qualification system that contains around 900 full, partial, and add-on qualifications, around 600 full qualifications, and any kind of qualifications which are in the register can be acquired through the validation process. And but it's regulated the Act on Vocational Education and the government decree on the operation of the National Vocational Qualification Register, so that we don't have any link with the National Qualification Framework, so to say. For the models, the Hungarian case fits to the no-no solution, so that the certificate acquired through a validation or through the learning process, they are the same in terms of content, and there is no differentiation between the paper proving the qualification, whether it's get in the system or through the validation process. And the Hungarian policy makers wish to keep this not one-size-solution model maintained, so that's to have a decentralized approach and not to follow the national model of validation as the council recommendation insists on the member states. So at the present, we see the situation will be valid for a couple of years in this sense. So the professional, for professional and labor market purposes, the validation can be done, and the vocational qualification can be acquired through the validation process.
Thank you for sharing your country experience, and I see participants from Norway and France would like to contribute to the discussion.
Thank you. I would like to sign the concerns level in the other comments. I think one of the main issues is the fitness purpose here, and definitely on the question of whether validation can give you a full qualification or a partial qualification, but also, is it a validation with a purpose? Is it giving you access to something, or is it validation with no particular purpose? And if it has a purpose, then you can combine it with any kind of learning programs which would have that important and essential quality feedback that is essential to any qualification, whereas if you have validation without any purpose, then no such quality feedback exists, hence it could never and should never be a qualification. So, for a quick reply on the fourth point on the slide there, what other characteristics do you think is important? I would propose to distinguish between transitive and intransitive validation as a possible characteristics for different models. Thank you.
Yes, I have a question about this topic. I have the impression that validation of previous competencies it's being used about fitness for purposes that you advocated. It was used a lot in France for career progressions. So there were people that it's a very difficult path to obtain a validation. So we have commissions, so we have to prepare quite an important dossier. We have to be supported also by guidance in order to pass all the stages, all the steps. And this kind of procedures I have the feeling, I'm not sure, but I have the feeling that this was used mostly for career progression. So in order to achieve a higher level of education that permits to open up to new salaries, to new job positions, and so on and so forth. It is not yet. I have the feeling that it's not so much used as an instrument for integrated people in the labor market. I think I'm not an expert of this field, but I have the impression that if the purpose was to open up opportunities for job seekers, I'm not sure that this instrument had the impact, the attended impact, the expected impact on this point. I'm talking about France, but maybe.
But I think it depends on the country, because in France, when I saw statistics of validation, I saw that it's used by employed people in France, especially to confirm the experience, and there are many managers who would like to confirm the ability to manage, to direct projects, for example.
So there are people that are already in the labor market,
yes,
and they want to progress.
Yes,
and they want to progress. So, but for the others, it comes to my question. My question was for Mrs. Singh. Do you have knowledge as a UNESCO official of a country, and specifically development country, where validation of previous learning has been specifically adopted with job seeker integration into the labor market, or integration in the formal labor market as an instrument for integration in the formal labor market? Because I don't have knowledge of cases of this.
I think it really is being used a lot in developing countries. One thing, to certify the labor force, which has a lot of skills but have not had a certificate, and to recognize all the unrecognized talent and skills that they have, in order to tell the world that let's say India has a good certified workforce. That's one of the reasons why validation, for example, in India is getting quite a lot of prominence. That's one of the things. In the informal economy, people go about their productive activities, but they're not bothered about being certified. So we have only 2% of the people have a formal vocational education and training, but there are 80% of the people who are working in the informal economy and who do not have their unrecognized skills and competencies recognized. So validation is playing a very important role in the labor market in this sense, but it is also stimulating a market for training, you know, because then you do validation and then you do a skill gap process, and then you have training programs which fortunately, because of the National Qualification Framework, we have qualification, so there is a pathway to a qualification. So that is, I think it's very much one of a very developing country or emerging economy.
It has an impact in India. It has an impact in India, this kind of...
It is beginning. They don't know how to do the process. You know, we don't know how to, we don't have this culture of validation, which has been growing in USA, Canada, and Europe. We still have to learn how to do validation. You know, the process is not a lot of training. There is no buy-in from a lot of training programs. So what people do is they say you're supposed to actually have validation before you enter a training program, but training providers don't want to do validation. They find it a very cumbersome program, so they just put them into a training program, you know? So we're still at that stage. So it is a very, very, it's called validation, but it isn't. But I think what Christoph Grinch said was very important, that, you know, it's not about only prior learning, it's also about emerging skills, the new emergent skills, you know. And if you look at enterprises, and if you want to promote green skills, for example, in enterprises, I think validation is a very, very important process, you know. But the idea is now to also make enterprises, employers, and industry aware how important validation is to make the stock of skills that are available in the labor market visible, you know, so that, and then to see to what extent these skills can, you know, how you can use these skills to even to validate these skills, so that people can get access to more emergent skills, like, you know, environmental, green technologies, renewable energies, and what have you. There's a lot of solar energy installers and things like that. Now they're making new qualifications for a solar energy installation, or for renewable energy, or for, you know, let's say for, you know, hygiene and safety in occupational sector, you know. So these sort of things, for example, occupational safety is becoming a very important qualification now, a supplementary qualification. It's an add-on qualification which is added on to a lot of qualifications. So these new things are coming up, these new emergent skills, and if you don't have them at some level, you know, you're just going to have a very ad hoc, dead-end training program. So, I mean, there is, at least with the National Skills Qualification Framework, at least you have clarity in terms of the pathways. But I think what the point which Christopher pointed out is very important, about talking about the new emerging skills that are digital skills, ICT skills, and all that. We can't only talk about prior learning, you know, we can't stop at that. So I think that is a very important point. And of course, the question of how can validation promote further education and training, and there we need to learn from France, you know, or from Germany. It's all about progression into education, further education. It's not necessary, labor market will come, but I think it's the educational aspect, which is very often ignored in validation. You know, it's as if even the upskilling pathways, the European, I'm very critical about that thing. It is about how can low qualified people get into new jobs, you know, but they don't talk about compensating for their lack of education, basic education, literacies, and things like that.
Answering Mateo's question, I can say that I participated in last Biennale, validation Biennale in Denmark, and there was an expert from South Africa, and she shared very touching cases of people, their life changed after validation. They suffered poverty, and later, after recognition, they entered to the labor market, and that was something very changing the quality of life.
While I was listening to the discussion, there were several things that I was made more clear to me in regards to validation. First of all, the language we are using, English, when we are talking about validation of non-formal, informal learning, when we are talking about recognition of prior learning and so forth and so on, it was made very clear to me from the cases of Hungary and England that the very terms might be understood differently by many people. When I'm thinking about validation, I'm thinking more in the Polish case, which is we divorced the process of assessment from the process of learning, and we are thinking more about validation of learning outcomes as a whole, not thinking that though we are talking only about knowledge and skills that were taken from the work experience, or only about the knowledge, skills taken from the formal education. We are thinking more about what is in the qualification and how to assess that in order to be certain that the person actually has the required skills and knowledge and have social competences. But this is a Polish case. But this is why I was rather surprised when I was hearing about validation of non-formal learning is only about work-based experience, or something like that, that could be taken into context of a different country. So my main conclusion is that, as trite as it seems, we cannot, it's very difficult to speak about validation in international context without going further into the details of one specific system, because we've heard about different approaches to validation, we've heard about different target groups, we've heard about different language to describe our own country mechanisms, and we heard about different methods. For me, for instance, checking only what a person can do by observing them in the workplace is not enough, and it's obvious to me that you should, if need arises, supplement it with other methods, for instance, oral presentation or a test, something like that. But this is because in Poland we allow for it. We actually demand that you should use different methods to assess whether a person actually achieved the required learning outcomes. So I was actually, I wanted to thank you for sharing your experience, because at least to me it also meant that I moved beyond simple terms to maybe more meaning behind them. I don't know if I'm clear in that, but all in all, I do agree that, at least in Polish context, the main difficulty would be in providing the right conditions of assessment. Make certain that we've got the appropriate resources, we are using the appropriate methods to, at the end, have certainty that the person that is being assessed, whether they have achieved their learning through work-based learning or through, I don't know, their hobbies or through unfinished school, that they indeed do have required knowledge, skills, social competence.
Thank you. If there are any other questions or comments? If no, thank you very much for participating in this session and go through another